A terrible stench filled every corner of the royal palace in Madrid, and even the doorkeepers shuddered at the harbinger of doom. From the deep corridors of the royal Alcazar came agonizing moans, but it was not the cries that frightened the courtiers most, but the sickly, cloying smell of death seeping under the low-hanging door of the cell. Inside, under ash-white sheets that had not been changed for a long time and were stained with blood, Isabella of Valois, Queen of Spain, was breathing her last breaths. She was only 23 years old, the daughter of the French king and niece of the powerful Catherine de' Medici. Her delicate body was covered with thousands of tiny creatures. In her hair, tangled into a tight braid, tiny lice the size of rice grains stubbornly dug into her skin. Fleas jumped desperately on the rags of her robe, and maggots slowly crawled out of the sinister wounds on her neck and hands, spawned by her rotten flesh. Her once delicate skin had turned into a crumbling, necrotic shell, and even her tears seemed like drops of poisonous exudate. Her husband, Philip II, king of vast estates, who had personally erected the Escorial as a symbol of the divine destiny of the monarchy, was unable to suppress the inner coldness born of fanatical austerity and burdened by guilt that his faith had turned into torture for the flesh of his young wife. They said that the body does not lie, and Isabella's body told of the pernicious union of religious zeal and the ideal of cardinal virtue, which turned a French princess into living ashes. The story began long before the gloomy January of 1568. Born on April 2, 1545, in the magnificent castle of Fontainebleau, Isabella was bathed in rose water scented with jasmine from childhood and was considered the embodiment of a new era where beauty and education went hand in hand. Scholars and courtiers, mindful of the recent Italian war and France's heavy losses, placed their hopes in the young princess to strengthen the peace forged in the peace treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559. Parisian salon conversations echoed those of the Spanish chambers about the setting sun of the Habsburgs, and the Catholic king of France, Henry II, lived out his last days preparing his daughter for marriage to Philip II. In January 1561, Isabella crossed the Pyrenees and entered a world of strict confessions and severe fasting, where bathing customs were replaced by the ritual of sparing ablutions, and the scent of roses gave way to holy water and the bitterness of remorse. Her ladies insisted that washing for pleasure was a luxury of the unfaithful, and under pressure from Spanish advisors, the princess gradually lost her former comforts. Her skin began to crack, her immunity declined, and then, according to Jesuit doctors, her duty to God turned into deadly torture of the body. Thus ended a tragedy in which crossed holy symbols and human cruelty proved stronger than all science and compassion. If you enjoy these kinds of peaceful stories about history, please subscribe to the channel. It's free and helps me keep going. Could innocent care for the body turn into a severe test of faith? When the queen's skin began to crack from dryness and irritation, these scars were not a sign of illness, but of repentance. In the fall of 1560, young Isabella of Valois, brought from France to Spain as a dowry for an early dynastic union between the cities of La Conte and Madrid, faced an unexpected confrontation between her own body and religious strictness. Her skin, accustomed to daily baths and the light scents of Provençal herbs, became covered with itchy scabs, but the court confessors declared these sufferings to be a divine sign of purification of the soul. Things got worse when the princess got pregnant for the first time in late fall. Her Jesuit confessor, Father Martinez, reminded her that her body had become a sacred womb, a tabernacle in which the heir to the Spanish throne was being born. It was believed that warm water could upset the balance of the four bodily humors, threatening the very existence of royal blood. Martinez, a man with sunken eyes and a dry voice, relied on the sermons of Saint Brigitta of Sweden and the life of Saint Agatha, who renounced all bodily pleasures for the sake of supreme purity. Such examples of ancient ascetics seem to Isabella to be revelations, not manipulation by men who were far removed from the female condition. A bath is a sin of lust, her confessor convinced her when, feeling a slight roundness in her stomach, she dreamed of a cool font. Perfumes are vanity. Only suffering elevates the soul to God's grace. Hoping to earn the mercy of the Almighty and win the trust of the suspicious Spanish court, where her French origins were constantly reminded to her with critical glances, Isabella took every word as a divine command. Her ladies-in-waiting, in particular Madame de Clément, who had raised the princess since childhood, begged her to relax the restrictions and at least change her underwear once a week. But Isabella, with religious zeal bordering on inner tension, replied quietly but firmly, "My body belongs to the Holy Spirit." She refused to bathe, stopped changing her underwear, and forgot to comb her hair. For almost a month, strand by strand, her hair turned into a terry carpet, which gave off the smell of rancid wax from the numerous layers of wax masks and ointments. At night, the princess knelt until dawn, murmuring prayers, and during the day she secretly beat herself with a chain borrowed from a nun from a convent of barefoot Carmelites. The skin on her wrists began to peel off in bloody crusts, but she regarded every drop of blood as a holy sacrifice in honor of the child growing in her troubled womb. In the end, her first pregnancy ended tragically on a February night in 1561, when the frozen winds of the Vincennes forest brought snow to the arches of the Alcazar. The baby did not survive. Isabella, broken by grief and convinced that this outcome was punishment for her insufficiently strict asceticism, fell into an even more cruel practice of self-humiliation. Her nails grew into painful claws, breaking and bleeding from obsessive scratching, and sores spread across her face and body, which the princess explained as divine stigmata. Whispers about the queen's gloomy lifestyle spread through the palace corridors, where courtiers struggled to contain their compassion for the fanatical piety of the young mother desperately seeking salvation for her lost heir. Like a crown of thorns reflected in her torment, no one could have guessed that the crown would turn out to be such a trial. Her painful scars were a reminder of her vow of silent sacrifice. In 1559, 15-year-old Isabella of Valois arrived in Madrid to seal the union between Spain and France. Her marriage to King Philip II was supposed to serve as a bulwark of the Counter-Reformation and strengthen the Catholic faith. But within a few years, her body became the scene of unprecedented suffering. Her skin was covered with purulent rashes, painful scabs, and ulcers that refused to heal. Her confessors, led by Father Juan de Cruz, convinced her that these were nothing more than signs of holiness, a necessary sacrifice to atone for the sins of the Bourbon and Habsburg families. Isabella, raised in the traditions of Spanish asceticism and familiar with the cruel ascetic practices of the great Teresa of Avila, gave herself over to pain, believing that every drop of blood brought her soul closer to heaven. First, lice settled on her head, tiny creatures barely visible in her thick, unwashed hair, where they found a real paradise and soon turned into a raging colony. The queen lamented that God had sent her these little crosses for purification and refused even to touch a metal comb. Killing God's creation was a crime against mercy. Then came the fleas. They jumped out of the dusty carpets of the Escorial Palace and hid in the folds of expensive, long unchanged dresses, leaving red blisters all over the body, which burst with unbearable itching and filled with pus. Philip, who had conquered the Netherlands and was hardened by political intrigue, could hardly stand his own queen. Their meetings were reduced to brief nods in the audience chamber and finally ceased altogether when disgust replaced their former respect. But the most horrific saga unfolded when the ulcers became infected with fly larvae. In 1564, Isabella no longer resembled a living person, but rather a breathing corpse, ravaged by hundreds of tiny worms that created labyrinths under her skin and laid their painful eggs there. Her second pregnancy in these conditions was considered by her contemporaries to be an unthinkable crime against common sense. Not a single doctor, even in the glorious tradition of medieval medicine, could offer an effective treatment, limiting themselves to prayers and incense. The rustle of her dresses made of French silk, which once shone in the light, turned into a foul-smelling crunch of old dirt, crystallized together with sweat and bloody secretions. The gold embroidery was hidden under hard scales of crust, and the pearls on her corsets had tarnished, covered with an oily film. Her silk shoes had fallen apart from the inside, and the queen's bare feet left bloody puddles on the marble floor of the palace halls. The larvae not only filled the open wounds, but also dug tunnels under the skin, leaving barely noticeable waves that experienced court physicians could only see up close, standing on the verge of fainting. For Isabella, this constant crawling and tickling was a sign of the life of holy martyrs. She took every tingle as a touch from pure souls descending from heaven. Her relatives and courtiers, struck by her fanatical devotion, anxiously anticipated the consequences. The royal title was increasingly slipping away from his exhausted wife, and after her death in 1564, Philip II never found in marriage the comfort he had once sought in sealing the dynastic union. Have you ever wondered what true horror looks like in the royal chambers? The old stones of the courtyard seemed to be saturated with a putrid stench and the hoarse buzzing of winged creatures. Dr. Olivares, the queen's personal physician, noted in his secret records, her hands were covered with parallel furrows where larvae dug highways into her flesh, and on her neck, swollen bumps moved in unison, as if thousands of insects were breathing in unison. With each exhalation, tiny flies flew out, and when the queen coughed, tiny parasite eggs scattered from her mouth. Isabella of Valois, who became Philip II's third wife in order to strengthen the alliance between Spain and France, played a delicate court game, but her body fell victim to uneducated doctors and poor hygiene in the 16th century. At that time, doctors still believed in miasma and did not know how to fight microscopic threats. On August 12, 1566, in conditions that were deadly for most women in childbirth, the queen gave birth to the infant Isabella Clara Eugenia. Immediately after birth, the baby let out such a piercing cry that it seemed as if her inner senses were sensing that her mother's life was teetering on the brink between sanctity and sheer nightmare. The midwives tirelessly shooed away annoying insects, wiped infectious secretions from the queen's hands, and brushed away large worms crawling down the bedspreads. Clouds of flies obscured the candlelight so much that the doctors could barely make out the patches of bloody clots on the sheets. The very birth of a healthy princess was a miracle. Many courtiers were convinced that only divine providence had preserved this fragile life in the lair of inhuman horror. However, for Isabella of Valois, this miracle turned into a curse. The birth wounds did not heal, soon turning into new entry points for colonies of parasites. Instead of blood, a thick, dark liquid flowed, exuding such a smell of decay that clouds of flies gathered throughout the Alcazar, as if the air itself had been infected with the plague. The French ladies, loyal to the former queen, left the court citing illness, and the Spanish maids stood at the door for only a few hours. Serving Isabella had become a public martyrdom, desired by few. Only two remained loyal: the nun Salomia de la Cruz, who saw the queen suffering as a sign of holiness, and the elderly maid Juana Lopez, who had lost her sense of smell in childhood. They pressed holy water to her lips, changed her sheets soaked with pus, and pinched out the worms that had fallen out as best they could. Meanwhile, in the corridors of the Alcazar, people whispered that the queen was a new miracle, that her scent was the smell of holiness, akin to the torments of martyrs. No one admitted it out loud. Isabella of Valois was dying in the most horrible way. Her body was being eaten by the creatures she had once summoned to protect herself from disease in the name of piety. The summer of 1568 brought hellish heat to Madrid, accelerating the decay to unimaginable limits. The windows of her bedchamber remained sealed. The smell seeped throughout the palace and threatened an epidemic. The queen could no longer move, her legs swollen to incredible sizes and filled with festering boils, barely held up her emaciated body, in which the last spark of life still glowed. The ominous silence of the alcove kept a secret that even kings were afraid to acknowledge. What was happening in her chambers became a tragic symbol of religious fanaticism. In the year 1568, the young Queen Isabella of Valois, daughter of King Henry II and Catherine de' Medici, who had arrived from France for a dynastic union with the Habsburgs on the eve of the Council of Trent, when European monarchs were seeking unity to counter the Protestant Reformation and Ottoman expansion. Her hands, torn to the bone from constant self-flagellation, did not tremble of her own accord, but because larvae were multiplying under her fingernails and in the cracks of her skin, thirsting for air and darkness at the same time. Her swollen legs barely supported her emaciated body, which bore the consequences of strict fasting and harsh asceticism imposed during the Counter-Reformation and intensified by the influence of the Spanish Inquisition. A thick strand of her hair, which had not seen water for 8 years, had turned into a tangle where giant colonies of lice multiplied. At first, a few worms emerged from the queen's throat during coughing fits, but soon they turned into an avalanche that filled every attempt to utter a word. Isabella's marriage, intended to strengthen alliances, turned into a court scandal. Rumors of the mysterious illness and agony of the Spanish king's wife destroyed diplomatic hopes and forced the court to tighten rules of conduct and private rituals. When Philip II, who loved his wife deeply, finally approached the doors of her alcove, the acrid smell of decay knocked him unconscious before he even touched her skin. On October 3, 1568, Isabella of Valois breathed her last breath, but even her dead body continued to writhe under the onslaught of parasites for several hours. Her confessors extolled her agony as the highest act of holiness, proclaiming that she had died in the scent of divine purity, while the Spanish people mourned their pious queen. Philip II organized a lavish funeral, and the true cause of her agonizing death was hidden behind a facade of piety. This madness was the result of ideals that demanded Isabella destroy her own flesh in the name of saving her soul. And it was only 300 years later, when historians gained access to the secret archives of the Vatican, they discovered the file on the beatification of Isabella of Valois, describing her asceticism as mortification of the flesh for the sake of divine grace. This tragic story, long hidden behind plausible religious arguments, reminds us that fanaticism, masquerading as virtue, is capable of destroying human life, and its sinister imprint continues to echo to this day.